At Thanksgiving dinner, my brother got up and said proudly, "Mom and Dad are giving the family business to me. You get nothing, little sister." Everyone at the table cheered and lifted their glasses. I just smiled, took a drink of wine, and said calmly, "Dad, should I tell them now, or do you want to?" His fork hit his plate with a loud clang. My brother's face turned bright red as he yelled, "Tell us what?" This isn't just the story of a Thanksgiving dinner. This is the Thanksgiving my family imploded, the night they thought they'd crown my brother, unaware I held the match that would light their entire world on fire. The dining room that year was packed, a chaotic tapestry of fall colors and forced smiles. Uncles I barely knew, aunts with too much gossip, cousins I hadn't seen since we were kids. Everyone was there, bathed in the chandelier's warm glow reflecting off polished silverware. Then, Ethan, my older brother, rose from the table. He stood there, with that smug confidence he always had, like a king about to receive his crown. He raised his glass high and announced it to the room. "Mom and Dad are signing the company over to me. Little sis gets nothing." The table erupted. Cheers, applause, even whistles. It felt less like Thanksgiving and more like, well, a coronation. But I didn't clap. I didn't even blink. I just calmly, deliberately, set my wine glass down. Then I looked straight at my dad, my voice as steady as still water, and asked, "Dad, should I tell them now, or will you?" His fork slipped from his hand, hitting his plate with a sharp, startling clang. Ethan's face, which had been beaming moments before, flushed a furious, bright red. For most of my life, I was the invisible child in a family built on legacy, on hierarchy, and on a last name that carried far too much weight in our small Midwestern town. Our family company, Bennett Industrial Solutions, was Grandpa Walt's baby. He founded it back in '76, a man everyone called brilliant, stubborn, and decades ahead of his time. To me, he was just Grandpa Walt, the only person who ever looked at me and saw more than just Ethan's little sister. He saw someone with a mind worth listening to. Some of my earliest memories are from the factory floor. I was like 7, in tiny sneakers and pigtails, trailing after Grandpa as he moved between roaring machines. He'd crouch down, hold up a blueprint, and say, "See this, Ava? A good business is like a good engine. Every part matters, even the ones people overlook." I didn't know it then, but he was talking about me. He'd pat my shoulder and declare, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This one has the brain for business." He said it in front of employees, relatives, even my parents. Mom would offer an awkward smile. Dad would clear his throat. And Ethan? Ethan would roll his eyes, so hard it was a wonder they didn't get stuck. Grandpa's approval made him absolutely furious. In our house, praise was a currency, tightly controlled, and Ethan believed every single compliment belonged to him by birthright. Then, when I was 12, everything changed. Grandpa died. Suddenly. A heart attack. Quick, cruel. I remember the funeral, the rain, my grandmother's shaking hands, and my father stepping into the role of grieving son and ambitious heir with terrifying speed. The moment Grandpa was buried, his office keys were already jangling in Dad's pocket. That was the year I learned what it meant to be just a girl in a family business run by men who refused to see past tradition. Dad held a meeting with the extended family in the big conference room, a room I wasn't allowed into, even though I'd spent more time in that building than half the adults working there. When it was over, Ethan swaggered out, chin high, chest puffed, wearing a blazer 2 sizes too big that Dad insisted made him look like a future CEO. He was 14. That night at dinner, Dad made an announcement, one he clearly thought was noble and wise. "From now on," he declared, resting a proud hand on Ethan's shoulder, "I'll be training your brother to take over the company someday. That's how it should be. This business stays with the men in the family." I looked up from my plate, blinking. "What about me?" Mom froze. Dad chuckled. Ethan smirked. "Ava," Dad said, gently, as if explaining weather patterns to a toddler, "Sweetheart, you're going to grow up, get married, and have your own life. This company isn't meant for daughters. Your brother is the legacy. That's how it's always been." It was the first time my stomach dropped with that familiar heaviness, that crushing truth I would hear repeated for years. Girls don't get the company. Girls don't inherit. Girls don't lead. I wasn't angry then. I was 12. I just felt dismissed. Pushed aside like an extra chair no one needed, but no one bothered to throw out. As Ethan grew older, Dad's favoritism hardened into something sharper, more deliberate. He enrolled Ethan in private leadership camps, business seminars, entrepreneurship competitions, every opportunity money could buy. Meanwhile, I wasn't even permitted to join the debate team because that kind of stuff won't matter for your future. The irony? Ethan hated every one of those activities. He skipped seminars to go partying, left business books untouched, and treated his training like a prolonged joke. He wanted the title, the applause, the bragging rights, never the work. But me? I loved the company. I loved the numbers. I loved the structure. I loved everything about the machine Grandpa built. And Dad saw that love as a threat. So, he gave me a role in the company, unpaid of course. Starting at 13, he made me sort invoices, clean storage rooms, input data, answer phones, prepare documents. Everything except the things that mattered. But I paid attention anyway. I listened at the door to strategy meetings. I read the discarded drafts of proposals. I memorized the way Grandpa wrote marginal notes on old files. I learned by watching. And every time I offered an idea, even a small one, Dad would wave a hand dismissively. Go help your mother. Don't interrupt. I don't have time. Ethan's the one who needs to learn this. The thing is, Ethan didn't learn any of it. He didn't want to. He would sit across from Dad in meetings, nodding like an obedient puppet, then go home and brag to his friends about running the company someday while he played video games until 3 a.m. I watched it all, helplessly. This widening gap between who held the power and who actually understood how to wield it. And every time I found a way to contribute, no matter how small, Dad stomped it out with the same old refrain. Ava, stop trying to compete with your brother. You're a girl. You'll have a different path. A different path. They said it so many times it lodged itself in my throat like a stone. But the worst moment, the one that still slices into me whenever Thanksgiving rolls around, happened when I was 16. I'd worked for weeks on a proposal for a cost-saving system for the factory supply chain. Grandpa had taught me the basics when I was 7, and I'd expanded on it with everything I'd learned from those unimportant tasks Dad threw at me. I printed it, bound it, and left it on Dad's desk. He didn't even read it. He handed it to Ethan and said, "Here, present this at the meeting. Good practice for you." And Ethan did, word for word. He didn't even understand half of it. But everyone clapped anyway. I stood in the hallway holding a stack of files, listening to them congratulate him while he took credit for something I built with my own brain. I didn't cry. Not there. I waited until I got home, shut myself in my room, and pressed my face into a pillow so no one would hear. That was the day I realized I wasn't just being overlooked. I was being erased. Not because I lacked talent, not because I wasn't capable, but because I wasn't born male, and because the one person who believed in me, Grandpa, was no longer there to protect me. That was my first true heartbreak. Not a boy, not a friend, but a legacy, a future, a birthright that evaporated the moment the only man who saw my worth was lowered into the ground. And that pain, the pain of being pushed out of my own family story, would become the fuel for everything I did next. Leaving home at 18 wasn't a dramatic movie scene for me. No slammed doors, no shouted arguments, no tearful promises to come back stronger. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I remember standing at the edge of our driveway at dawn, my entire life packed into a single second-hand suitcase, waiting for the ride-share that would take me to the airport. The house behind me was still dark. Every window shut. Every door closed. Exactly how my family had always preferred to keep themselves from seeing me. No one woke up to say goodbye, not even out of politeness. But the moment I stepped onto that plane, something inside me clicked into place. For the first time, the world felt like mine to claim, instead of something I had to fight my brother for. I moved into a tiny dorm room at a university states away, one of the few that had offered me a full scholarship in finance and business analytics. I worked 3 part-time jobs, lived on microwave noodles, shared textbooks with classmates, and studied until my vision blurred. And I loved it. Because every lecture, every textbook chapter, every late-night problem set felt like another brick being laid on a foundation I was finally allowed to build for myself. It didn't take long for professors to notice the way I processed numbers differently. I wasn't the loudest in the room, but I was the one people always turned to when a case study had an angle no one else could crack. I had a way of seeing patterns, cost structures, valuation gaps, inefficiencies that others missed. Maybe it was all those years studying from the sidelines while Ethan got credit for work he didn't understand. Maybe it was Grandpa's voice in my head. Every part matters, especially the ones people overlook. During my junior year, I earned a coveted summer internship at a well-respected investment firm specializing in corporate acquisitions. On the first day, I walked into a glass tower filled with people who carried themselves like the world bent for them. I felt small, almost fragile, but I knew I belonged in that building more than I ever belonged in the one bearing my family's name. I volunteered for every assignment, boring data cleaning, financial modeling, 12-hour research shifts. And for the first time, when I produced good work, no one claimed it. No one dismissed it. And no one told me it belonged to my brother. My analysis helped the team uncover an undervalued manufacturing firm with a hidden intellectual property portfolio. The deal closed for a fraction of what the asset was worth. The partners congratulated everyone on the team, but my manager pulled me aside afterward. "You've got something rare, Ava," he told me, tapping the report I'd written. "You see value where others don't. That's not something you can teach." It was the closest thing to praise I'd received in 6 years. It hit me harder than I expected. By the end of the summer, the firm offered me a full-time position for after graduation. I accepted instantly. Not because I didn't have options, I had several, but because this was the first place that recognized what my family had spent my entire childhood denying. My mind mattered. My talent mattered. I mattered. When I graduated at 22, I walked across the stage with honors. Mom and Dad didn't come. Ethan didn't send a message. No one from my family acknowledged it. But my firm sent flowers. My manager shook my hand so firmly it almost hurt. And the applause that echoed across the auditorium belonged to me, not someone with my last name. I dove headfirst into the world of mergers and acquisitions. It was ruthless, strategic, mathematical, and thrilling. I loved the adrenaline of evaluating whether a struggling business could be revived or whether a successful one was already rotting from the inside. I learned how companies rose, how they fell, how power shifted hands with every percentage point of ownership. I learned that control wasn't about who shouted loudest in family meetings. It was about who owned the votes. Within 2 years, I became an M&A analyst known for spotting undervalued companies before others even noticed the cracks in their armor. My boss promoted me early, twice. And once, during a late-night review of an acquisition target, he stopped mid-sentence, closed the folder, and looked at me the way Grandpa used to. "Ava," he said, "you have the kind of mind that can build empires. Or take them apart. You just have to choose which one you want." His words hit deeper than he knew. Because the empire I cared about was one I was never allowed to touch, the one my grandfather built, the one that had been withheld from me. Not because I lacked skill, but because I lacked a Y chromosome. So I did something small at first, something quiet. I began investing my savings. Nothing dramatic. Just a few thousand here and there into small, family-owned regional businesses. I wanted to understand firsthand how ownership worked, how equity diluted, how older shareholders made decisions, how voting power shifted when someone accumulated enough shares. I met elderly founders who reminded me of Grandpa, stubborn but brilliant. Retired employees who still held token shares. Cousins who inherited stock they didn't want. Widows who didn't understand the value of what they owned. And as I built relationships, something unexpected happened. People trusted me. They saw my sincerity. They liked my questions. They admired how I studied everything instead of pretending to know it all. They started offering me shares. Small percentages, symbolic even. But each transaction taught me a lesson my family tried to hide. Ownership is power. Quiet power. Invisible power. The kind of power no one notices until it's too late. Over the next few years, my portfolio grew. My financial literacy sharpened into instinct. I learned to read balance sheets the way some people read faces. I understood markets at a bone-deep level. I learned not just how to buy shares, but how to position myself so that when the time came, I could influence decisions others assumed were already locked in. And with every step forward, with every credential gained, with every investment made, a truth took root inside me. I wasn't meant to be an observer in my family's legacy. I wasn't meant to be erased. I wasn't meant to sit quietly watching Ethan be handed a crown he never earned. I was meant to build something of my own, and perhaps, one day, take back what should have been mine all along. That thought, the one I buried deep, would become the spark of the twist waiting at the next Thanksgiving table. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day when nothing in your life is supposed to shift, but everything does. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor, reviewing a list of potential acquisition targets with a major client. It was a routine meeting, the kind I'd participated in dozens of times. Columns of numbers, distressed companies, underperforming divisions, strategic opportunities. But as the client scrolled through the slide deck, a familiar name materialized on the screen, sitting casually in the middle of a list of potential sell-offs. Bennett Industrial Solutions. Preliminary interest from private equity group. My breath froze somewhere between my lungs and my throat. I blinked once, twice, convinced I'd misread it. But no. My family's company, my grandfather's life's work, was being quietly considered for sale. And somehow, despite all the years I had spent working in finance, all the deals I had analyzed, all the businesses I had helped evaluate, no one in my own family had breathed a word of this to me. The rest of the meeting blurred into static. I nodded at the right times, took notes automatically, asked technical questions that came out on instinct alone, but my mind was burning. Bennett Industrial being sold?
How? Why? Who initiated it?
The moment the meeting ended, I slipped out to the hallway, pulled out my phone and dialed. My father. He answered on the third ring, his voice clipped and businesslike. What is it, Ava? I'm in the middle of something. I didn't bother with pleasantries. Dad, is the company selling? Your company? Our company? Why is it on a list of potential acquisitions? There was a long silence on the other end, then a scoff. Where did you hear that? I saw it in a client deck. They're reviewing distressed manufacturing firms. Why is Bennett Industrial even on that radar? Another pause. Then his voice hardened. Ava, this is men's business. You don't need to concern yourself with it. I closed my eyes. Dad, that's not an answer. It's not your place to ask questions. His tone grew colder. Let the men handle the company affairs. You wouldn't understand what's going on. I felt the words like a slap. The person whose daily life revolved around valuing companies, assessing risk, and analyzing leverage, wouldn't understand. Dad, I tried again, controlling my voice. I work in corporate finance. I handle deals like this every day. I can help if you... Ava, his voice cut sharp. Don't get involved. I don't need my daughter meddling in matters she knows nothing about. Your brother, and I will take care of it. And then he hung up. I stood there in the empty corridor, staring at my phone screen as if it might apologize for delivering his voice to me. A mix of dread and humiliation settled heavy in my chest. After everything I had built, after clawing my way into a field dominated by men, after earning respect I was never given at home, my father still saw me as the 12-year-old girl who should go help her mother. I wasn't done. I needed clarity, even if it stung.
So I texted Ethan.
Is the company in trouble? Why is it being listed as a sell-off candidate? He responded 4 minutes later. 4 minutes was all it took for him to crush whatever hope I had that someone in my family might treat me like an adult. Ethan, LOL, you wouldn't get it. This is real business stuff. Don't embarrass yourself trying to sound smart. Then a follow-up. Just stay in your lane, little sis. Dad, and I got this. I stared at his messages until the words blurred. A laughless breath escaped me, the kind that builds from disbelief and ends in quiet devastation.
Stay in your lane.
Don't embarrass yourself. You wouldn't understand. It's men's business. It was like my childhood had reached through the years and grabbed me by the collar, dragging me back into the shadow. I thought I had finally escaped. I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind them I evaluated companies worth billions. Billion with a B. I wanted to tell them I could read their financial statements like they were children's books. I wanted to demand answers, respect, acknowledgement, anything. But I didn't do any of that. I sat down on a bench outside the conference rooms, folded my hands in my lap, and let the hurt swirl quietly inside me.
Why?
Because I knew exactly what would happen if I pushed. Dad would accuse me of being emotional. Ethan would mock me. Mom would stay silent. And the cycle would repeat. Silence wasn't weakness. Not for me. Not anymore. Silence was strategy. If the company truly was in trouble, and it clearly was, I wasn't going to waste energy trying to convince people who never wanted to listen in the first place. I would observe. I would investigate. I would wait. Because something inside me shifted that day. Something subtle, but irreversible. For years, I had tried to earn my family's respect through effort, talent, achievement, humility, and hard work. For years, I believed that if I just proved myself enough, they would finally see me. But now I saw the truth with painful clarity. They would never see me. They would never value me. They would never, not once, consider me anything other than a footnote in Ethan's story. And so, I stopped trying. Not out of bitterness. Out of acceptance. Because accepting it freed me. And in that space where their approval used to hold me hostage, I finally had room to think. If my father and brother were running the company into the ground, if Bennett Industrial was truly vulnerable, if the empire Grandpa built was collapsing under the weight of ego and incompetence, then maybe, just maybe, the person they had spent decades underestimating would be the one to save it. That painful moment, the humiliating dismissal of my call, the degrading text from Ethan, became the second lowest point in my story. But like every valley in my life, it was only setting the stage for what would rise afterward. And what would rise was power. I didn't sleep the night I saw my family's company listed as a potential sell-off. I lay awake in my apartment, city lights flickering through the blinds, replaying Dad's dismissive tone and Ethan's smug text messages until they carved themselves into my ribs. But beneath the hurt, something else stirred. Something sharper, steadier, colder. An instinct I had honed through years of studying acquisitions, takeovers, and the subtle art of corporate control. If Bennett Industrial was truly vulnerable, if Dad and Ethan were blind enough to let it slip toward the edge, then maybe, just maybe, the universe had finally opened a door they had spent decades slamming in my face. The next morning, I arrived at work early, coffee in hand, and pulled up everything I could find about the company's corporate structure. My father had always talked as if he owned the business outright, as if he and Ethan were the only possible heirs. But when I dug into the records, public filings, archival documents, old shareholder statements, I discovered the truth. Bennett Industrial was not wholly owned by my parents. Not even close. My grandfather had been old school, not in the sexist way my father liked to romanticize, but in the practical way real founders often are. He had built the company with a group of close friends, longtime employees, and early investors from the late 70s and early 80s. And because he trusted people, he had never consolidated ownership. When he died, my father inherited only a portion. A large portion, yes, but not the whole. And the rest? The rest was scattered like gold dust across time. My pulse quickened as I mapped it out. A retired plant manager who owned 4%. A former engineering partner holding 3%. Two cousins who had moved across the country, each with a little over 2%. A widow of an early investor with 1.8%. Several of Grandpa's old friends with anywhere between 0.5% and 2%. And a handful of tiny, forgotten shares held by employees from decades past. Individually, none of them mattered. Together, they were a kingdom waiting for the right ruler. And for the first time, I realized something. Dad and Ethan weren't kings. They were squatters sitting on a throne built by a man whose blood ran in my veins, not theirs. So, I started doing what I did best. I analyzed. I strategized. I planned. Then I acted. The first person I reached out to was Mr. Holloway, a retired engineer who had worked with my grandfather for 30 years. His name was on several old ownership documents. I found his number through public records and called him one Saturday morning, expecting a quick conversation. Instead, we ended up talking for almost 3 hours. He remembered me, not as Ethan's little sister, not as the girl, but as the kid who followed Grandpa around the factory, asking why machines made certain sounds and what a supply chain was. "Walt told me you were going to run this place someday," he said, his voice warm with nostalgia. "But your daddy, he never listened much." My throat tightened. "Mr. Holloway, would you ever consider selling your shares?" "Not to the company."
To me.
There was a pause, a long one, then a soft laugh. "I always knew you'd come back for it." And just like that, the first piece of the puzzle slid into place. We arranged a private deal. No announcements, no family involvement. A clean transaction. It felt like lighting a fuse. Quiet, small, yet capable of burning through everything that had once held me powerless. After that, I made a list of every shareholder I could find. Every name was a thread, and I pulled each one slowly, strategically. A widowed woman in Kansas who cried when she realized someone still remembered her husband's role in the early days of the company. A retired accountant living in Arizona who had no children and wanted his shares in the hands of someone sensible. A cousin who hadn't spoken to my side of the family in years and readily agreed to sell once he heard Ethan was expected to take over. "Your brother," he scoffed. "That boy couldn't run a lemonade stand." An old friend of Grandpa's who told me, "Your grandfather used to brag about how smart you were. Said you had the only real business head in the family." One by one they sold. Not because I pressured them. Not because I offered outrageous sums. They sold because they remembered my grandfather, the man whose values they trusted, and because, in some small way, they saw pieces of him in me. Every deal added another percentage point. Each contract was another heartbeat of power. Another inch of leverage. Another step toward the one thing my father believed I would never have. Ownership. I moved carefully, quietly, always through private channels, never through public filings that might allure my family. I used holding companies, trusts, and strategic intermediaries, perfectly legal, perfectly discreet. My boss didn't know. My coworkers didn't know. Even the people I was dating didn't know. It wasn't secrecy. It was survival. If Dad or Ethan discovered what I was doing, they would find a way to shut me out. Or worse, they'd rush to buy up the remaining shares before I could. But they never suspected a thing. Why would they? In their minds, I was the daughter who left, the girl who wouldn't understand business, the footnote in Ethan's destiny. And they clung so tightly to their delusions that they never thought to look behind them. Meanwhile, I kept going one acquisition at a time, one signature at a time, one silent victory at a time. And with every transaction, the scales tipped. Slowly at first. Then, unmistakably. There came a night, late, long after midnight, when I sat at my kitchen counter with a stack of papers spread around me. I looked at the totals, calculated the percentages twice, 3 times for times. Then I laughed. A soft, stunned, disbelieving sound. Because I realized something powerful, something monumental, something that changed everything in my blood. I wasn't just collecting old pieces of a fading company. I wasn't just following some sentimental desire to reconnect with Grandpa. I was building power, real power, legal power, the kind of power men like my father and brother feared without ever acknowledging it. I was becoming a force. And they still didn't know. That was my third rise. The moment I stopped being the overlooked daughter and became the quiet threat no one saw coming. The moment the story shifted from inheritance to takeover. By early November, the leaves in the city had turned the color of rusted copper, and every street corner smelled faintly of cinnamon and cold air. My life was moving in a quiet, powerful rhythm. Work, meetings, careful acquisitions. the slow but steady accumulation of ownership that no one in my family cared enough to notice. I felt like I was living two lives. One where I was a respected M&A specialist making strategic decisions for companies across the country, and another where I was a ghost in the halls of my own family's legacy, seen only when it was convenient for them. The invitation came on a Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't thoughtful. It wasn't even personally addressed. It was a mass email sent to the entire family with a subject line that made my stomach tighten: Thanksgiving dinner and special announcement honoring Ethan Bennett. I opened it. The words hit exactly where they intended. This year, we will be formally recognizing Ethan's leadership and announcing his transition into the role of CEO for Bennett Industrial Solutions.
CEO.
As if it were already done. As if the decision were unanimous. As if the entire company were their personal property to crown and pass down like a family heirloom. There was one sentence, almost an afterthought, buried near the bottom. Ava, we hope you can attend. No, would love to see you. No, please come home. Just an obligatory mention, like checking a box to avoid accusations of completely cutting me out. I stared at the screen for a long time, emotions rising and falling in quiet waves. Not because I was surprised. I knew this was coming. Ethan had been preparing for this moment since he was 14, and Dad decided he would be the heir. But the arrogance, the entitlement, the absolute confidence that the company was theirs to give away like a birthday present, it burned. Even after everything I had accomplished, some wounds still stung like they were fresh. I hadn't even decided whether to go when my Aunt Linda called. She was one of the few people in the family who had ever looked at me with something resembling kindness. Ava, she whispered the moment I answered, sounding like she was calling from behind a closed door. I heard you got the invitation. Yep. Listen to me. Her voice shook a little, like she was afraid someone might overhear. They're planning something. Your father, your brother, they won't embarrass you in front of the whole family. They've been bragging about this CEO announcement for weeks. I swallowed. Of course they have. No, Ava, you don't understand. Her breath hitched. They want to humiliate you. Make it clear you don't belong. They think it will look good. Ethan stepping up, you being gracious about it. They think you'll sit there quietly and clap. A fresh wave of heat prickled at my skin. Why are you telling me this? Because I saw your grandfather in you, and he never would have wanted this. Just don't let them break you. Don't let them. As if they hadn't already tried for most of my life. As if I hadn't already been dismissed, overlooked, minimized, and erased in ways that left scars I rarely spoke about. But there was something Aunt Linda didn't know. Something no one in my family knew. I wasn't the girl they used to humiliate. Not anymore. And when she whispered, "Are you going home?" I answered truthfully, "Yes, I am." But not for the reasons they expected. Not to clap for Ethan. Not to bow my head and smile politely while he accepted a crown built from my grandfather's sweat and brilliance. I was going because I carried a truth in my hands that would change everything. When Thanksgiving week arrived, the tension settled over me like a second skin. I worked during the day, but every night I found myself staring at the stack of documents I had collected: shareholder agreements, acquisition contracts, ownership breakdowns, proof of everything I had built quietly, strategically, deliberately. Every signature felt like a heartbeat. Every percentage point felt like a step forward. Every line on those pages was another piece of armor. But the night before I left for my hometown, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "Don't forget dinner is at 4. Try not to be late this time. It's an important night for the family." I laughed out loud. A small, sharp sound that echoed in my empty kitchen. Important night for the family. A night he believed would cement his legacy. The moment he'd get everything handed to him: title, company, prestige, while I would sit politely at the edge of the table like a decorative plant. He had no idea. None of them did. They were preparing a ceremony, a celebration, a coronation. And they had set the stage so perfectly, every detail lined up, every relative invited, every speech rehearsed. But what they didn't know was that they had also prepared the perfect battlefield, the perfect audience, the perfect moment. All I had to do was walk in, sit down, wait. And when the moment came, I would not be the girl they expected to humiliate. I would be the storm. The night before Thanksgiving, I packed a suitcase with simple clothes and my laptop bag. Then I opened my safe and pulled out the folder, thick, heavy, filled with signatures that represented years of strategy and patience. I held it in my hands for a long time, the weight familiar, almost comforting. Then I whispered, to no one and everyone, they have no idea what's coming. This was the third valley of my story. Not the lowest, not the darkest, but the last quiet moment before the floor dropped out from under my family. Because I was going home, not as the forgotten daughter, not as the overlooked outsider, but as a force none of them were prepared to face. 1 week before Thanksgiving, the city was already wrapped in early winter. Biting cold, gray skies, and the kind of sharp wind that forces people to tuck their chins into their coats. I was in my office reviewing end-of-quarter reports when my phone buzzed with a name that made my breath catch: Raymond Carter. Ray Carter had been one of my grandfather's closest friends, more like a brother in arms than a colleague. They had built the early prototypes together. He had been in the room when the first contracts were signed. He had been there the night my grandfather toasted the company's first profitable year. And he had retired in the mid-2000s, taking a small but meaningful share of the company with him. 7%. The exact 7% I needed. The last piece. The final keystone. My hands trembled slightly when I answered. Mr. Carter, this is Ava Bennett. His warm, gravelly voice crackled through the line. I was hoping you'd call me back, sweetheart. I've been thinking about what you said. I sat straighter, pulse quickening. I had called him weeks earlier, making the same quiet offer I had made to all the others. A private, respectful request to purchase his shares. No pressure, no manipulation, no dramatic speeches, just truth. I remember you, he continued. You were the one who sat on the counter in Walt's office, coloring on his blueprints, weren't you? I laughed softly. Guilty. He used to say, that girl sees things no one else does. A familiar ache squeezed my chest, grief for a man who had believed in me long before I learned to believe in myself. Mr. Carter cleared his throat. You're not doing this for power, are you? No, I answered without hesitation. I'm doing it because the company is in danger, and because my grandfather's legacy deserves better than what it's headed toward. There was a long silence on the other end. Then he said 6 words that changed everything. Let's meet. I'm ready to sign. We met at a small cafe 2 days later, early morning when the sun was just beginning to push through the clouds. He looked older than I remembered. White hair, deep wrinkles, a slow, careful walk, but his eyes were bright, sharp, and unmistakably the eyes of a man who had once built an empire alongside my grandfather. He slid the envelope across the table. 7%, he said. The last of what I have. My pulse hammered in my ears. I opened the folder slowly, reverently. The paperwork was neatly prepared. My attorney had drafted it, and Ray had reviewed everything carefully. Are you sure? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He smiled. Honey, I've been waiting 20 years for someone worthy to take this company back. He reached out, covering my hand with his. And between you and your brother, well, let's just say one of you works hard, and the other works hard at pretending. I couldn't help the small laugh that escaped me. He squeezed my hand. Your grandfather would be proud of you. Very proud. The weight of his words hit harder than anything Dad or Ethan had ever said to me. We signed right there in the cafe. Page after page, signature after signature. Every stroke of ink was another nail in the coffin of the narrative my family had built, one where Ethan was the heir and I was the afterthought. When we finished, Mr. Carter leaned back with a content sigh.
There.
It's done.
Done.
A simple word with seismic consequences. Because when he signed the last document, everything shifted. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. Legally. I crossed the line. I now held 51.3% of Bennett Industrial Solutions. A majority stake. Controlling interest. The right to appoint and remove the CEO. And no one in my family knew a single thing about it. I left the cafe with the folder clutched to my chest, the cold air stinging my cheeks. I walked slowly, trying to absorb the reality that my grandfather's legacy, something I had been denied my entire life, was finally, impossibly, in my hands. When I got back to the office, I went straight to the legal department of the investment firm. My attorney, a sharp, meticulous woman named Marissa, reviewed everything with a critical eye. After 40 minutes of cross-checking signatures, validating purchase agreements, and confirming share transfers, she closed the folder and looked at me.
Ava, she said.
You now have controlling ownership of the company. The words hit me like a physical force. I do. She nodded. Yes, you have full voting control, including CEO appointment and removal. There is no scenario where your brother can override you. I let out a slow, trembling breath. All the years of dismissal, of invisibility, of being told I would never lead because I was born a daughter instead of a son. All the years of being erased, belittled, overlooked. They all funneled into that single moment. Marissa watched me with a small, almost proud smile. You planned this well. But I shook my head. It wasn't a plan, I said softly. It was survival. After she left the room, I sat alone at the table, staring at the folder. My hands hovered over it, tracing the edges. Then I closed my eyes. Grandpa, I whispered. I did it. I finally did it. A wave of emotion rolled through me. Relief, pride, grief, triumph, all tangled together. For the first time, I didn't feel like a shadow in my own family. I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I didn't feel like someone waiting to be allowed into the room. I felt like someone who belonged at the head of the table. Someone who had earned her place. Someone who could at last protect the things she loved most. This was my fourth rise. Splendid, decisive, quiet, and powerful enough to reshape everything that would come next. My family thought Thanksgiving would be Ethan's coronation, but they had no idea the real crown was already on my head. The night before Thanksgiving felt unnervingly still. Too quiet, too heavy. As if the air itself were holding its breath with me. I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, the city shimmering beyond my windows in scattered reflections. The folder containing the shares, my 51.3%, lay open on the coffee table. Every signature, every number, every initial stared back at me like a truth too large to fit inside my chest. I should have felt powerful, secure, victorious. Instead, all I felt was the sharp sting of memory. I closed my eyes and let myself drift back to the version of me Grandpa Walt knew. The little girl who tugged on his sleeve during morning factory tours, who asked endless questions about profit margins and supply chains, who stood on his office chair while tracing her fingers over blueprints she could barely understand. You see the whole machine, Ava, he would say, tapping the center of my forehead with one calloused finger. Not just the pieces, not just the noise. The whole thing. You're the only one in this family who thinks like a builder. I used to glow under those words. I used to tuck them into my heart like a secret blessing. You're the one who understands business, he'd whisper, leaning close, as if protecting me from a truth the rest of the family refused to see. Remember that. Even when they don't. Even when they don't. Even when they never did. The ache rose slowly, spreading from somewhere deep in my ribs. I reached for the folder and pulled out one of the older contracts, Ray Carter's signature next to mine. Then Mrs. Callahan's. Then an old friend of Grandpa's named Thomas Rhee, who had told me through teary eyes how much he wished my grandfather were alive to see me reclaim what had been slipping away. I stared at those signatures, at the trail of quiet alliances I'd collected, and a question formed in my mind, one that had been chasing me for weeks. Was I saving my grandfather's legacy, or betraying my family? Dad and Ethan didn't deserve to run the company. I knew that. Everyone who had ever worked with them knew that. My father had allowed the business to stagnate under his pride. Ethan had no vision, no discipline, no respect for the work that built the company he believed he was entitled to. But they were still my family. As flawed as they were, as cruel as they'd been, they were my blood. And tomorrow, in a dining room filled with relatives, I would be the one to shatter their illusion of control. I would be the earthquake. They would feel the ground break. And even though the rational part of me knew I was doing what was right for the company, for the employees, for the legacy Grandpa entrusted to us, another part of me trembled under the weight of what was coming. I sat back on the couch, pulling my knees to my chest like I used to when I was little. The room blurred slightly, and before I could stop it, tears gathered and spilled down my cheeks. Not tears of guilt, not tears of regret, tears of longing. For love, for acceptance, for a family that had never chosen me, not once. I wiped my face with my sleeves, but the tears kept coming, soft and quiet. I wasn't crying for the company or the shares or the impending confrontation. I was crying for every year I spent trying to earn something that should have been freely given, a place in my own family. I cried for the 16-year-old girl whose proposal was stolen and handed to her brother. I cried for the 12-year-old who was told she'd never inherit because she'd grow up and get married. I cried for the 7-year-old who thought fixing machinery with Grandpa meant she belonged. And I cried for the adult woman who had carved out a life of independence, success, and power, yet still felt the hollow echo of never being loved the way she needed. When the last tear fell, I inhaled deeply, chest still trembling. The silence pressed in. The city hummed outside. Grandpa, I whispered into the darkness. Am I doing the right thing? If he were here, I knew exactly what he'd say. He would sit beside me, place his warm hand over mine, and tell me the truth he had always known. You're not destroying anything, Ava. You're saving what matters. I imagined his voice, steady, wise, unshakable. And slowly, the knot in my chest loosened. Because this wasn't betrayal. This was protection. This was stewardship. This was honoring a man who believed in me long before anyone else did. Still, the fear lingered. Not fear of what I would say tomorrow. Not fear of their reactions, their outrage, their accusations. I had already rehearsed every possible outcome. No, the fear that gnawed at me was far quieter, far older. What if, after everything, they still didn't care? What if stopping Ethan from destroying the company didn't change anything about the way they saw me? What if they still refused to see me, to choose me, to love me? I pulled my knees tighter and buried my face in my arms, letting myself crumble for just one night. One night before the storm. Tomorrow I would walk into that house wearing armor forged from every wound they'd inflicted. Tomorrow I would be unshakable. Tomorrow I would reveal the truth. But tonight, I let myself be the girl who missed her grandfather. The girl who wished her family had loved her differently. The girl who still had a soft heart beneath all the strategy and power. This was my fourth valley, the final dip, before the rise that would redefine everything. When I finally stood and closed the folder, I whispered into the quiet room, "Tomorrow, everything changes." And with that, I shut off the lights, knowing the dawn would bring the confrontation I had been preparing for my entire life. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the kind of bright, brittle sunlight that made everything feel sharper than it should have been. My stomach churned the entire drive back to my hometown, past the old water tower, past the diner where Grandpa used to take me for pancakes, past the familiar signs that once meant home, but now felt like markers on a path towards something inevitable, something explosive. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house was already buzzing. Cars lined the street. Laughter spilled through the open windows. The smell of roasted turkey and buttery rolls drifted through the crisp November air. A perfect family holiday if you didn't know what waited beneath the surface. I walked inside carrying only my coat, my handbag, and the thick envelope tucked safely inside. I was greeted with nods, stiff smiles, the obligatory, "There she is," murmured with the kind of politeness reserved for acquaintances, not family. No hugs, no warmth, just the role I had always been assigned, the outsider with the same last name. Dinner was set beautifully. White tablecloth, gold napkin rings, candles flickering along the center. Ethan sat near the head of the table, wearing a new suit and a smirk that made my skin crawl. Mom fluttered beside him, adjusting his tie like he was about to receive a Nobel Prize. Dad looked proud. Too proud. I sat down quietly, taking everything in, waiting. We made it through the salads, the small talk, The obligatory comments about work and life, most of which were directed to Ethan, who basked in the attention like a sunburn waiting to happen. Then it began. Right on cue. Dad tapped his glass. Everyone, if I could have your attention. Conversations quieted, heads turned, eyes brightened with anticipation. This was the moment. He looked at Ethan, beaming. Ethan stood up slowly, raising his wine glass as if he were about to deliver a presidential speech. As many of you know, he began, puffing his chest, my parents have been planning for the future of our family's company. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. And today, he continued, I'm proud to announce that Mom and Dad are signing the company over to me as the new CEO. Applause erupted. Actual applause. Clapping, cheering. A few relatives even whistled. I sat still, staring at the tablecloth, my heart beating calmly, steadily, cold and clear like a drum counting down to detonation. Ethan basked in the glory, raising his glass higher, to new beginnings. Everyone followed suit, lifting their glasses, faces glowing with pride. Everyone except me. I set my glass down deliberately, quietly. The soft clink cut through the noise like a blade. Dad noticed first. His smile faltered.
Ava.
I lifted my eyes and met his. Dad, I said softly, should I tell them now or will you? The room froze. Forks hovered midair. Hands paused halfway to their mouths. The candles flickered as if confused by the sudden silence. Dad blinked once, twice, his face drained of color. Ava, he warned quietly, don't do this. But I was already reaching into my handbag. I pulled out the thick envelope, the one that had traveled across states, across years of pain, across every barrier they tried to build to keep me small. I placed it directly in front of Ethan. He frowned. What's this? The truth, I said, since we're making announcements today. He laughed, a nervous, dismissive sound. Ava, stop being dramatic. I tapped the envelope. Open it. He ripped it open with exaggerated annoyance. But the moment he scanned the first page, his face twisted in confusion, then panic.
What?
What is this? The company, I said, my voice calm and steady as I rose to my feet, isn't being signed over to you. A ripple of shock traveled down the table. Dad stood up abruptly. Ava, that's enough. No, I said, it's not enough. Not yet. I looked at Ethan, who was now sweating through his expensive suit. You can't sign the company over, I continued, because you don't own enough shares to sign anything over. Ethan shoved the papers toward Dad. What is she talking about? He yelled, voice cracking. I pulled out the rest of the documents, spreading them across the table, pages and pages of ownership transfers, legal agreements, notarized sales. One cousin gasped. An aunt covered her mouth. Someone whispered, oh my God. Then I delivered the final blow. I own 51.3% of Bennett Industrial Solutions, I said clearly. I am the majority shareholder. Legally, that makes me the one who appoints the CEO. The room erupted, not in noise, but in a silence so complete it felt like the air had been sucked out of the house. Ethan stumbled backward, bumping into his chair. No, that's impossible. Dad, tell her she's lying. Dad's face was ashen, because he knew. He recognized the documents. He understood the legality. He saw the signatures, the ones he never knew were happening behind his back. And he realized the throne he had been polishing for Ethan was already gone. I turned to Ethan. He looked like a man watching his empire crumble beneath him. He looked exactly like I had looked over and over, growing up at that table. And Ethan, I said softly, it's not you. He froze, dead still, like a statue carved from disbelief and rage. Somewhere near the end of the table, a fork clattered against a plate, the loudest sound in a room full of people who had just watched a kingdom change hands in an instant. This exact moment was the peak of everything. The twist, the reveal, the truth that rewrote our entire family's story in one breath. And as they stared at me, every relative, every aunt, every cousin who had praised Ethan minutes before, I finally felt something I had chased my entire life. Not approval, not affection, but power. My rightful power. For a long moment after my final words, no one moved. The entire room sat suspended in a stunned, choking silence, the kind that follows a sudden impact when everyone is still trying to understand what just hit them. Candles flickered. Someone's wine glass trembled in their hand. Then everything broke at once. My father slammed his palms onto the table so hard the silverware jumped. His face flushed red, the vein in his forehead pulsing violently. "Ava," he roared. "What have you done?" My mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "How could you do this? How could you go behind our backs like this?" Ethan stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The color drained from his face. His eyes darted between the pages, trying to piece together the meaning he didn't want to accept. This can't be real. This can't be real. But it was. Every signature, every agreement, every inch of power he thought he was entitled to gone. Dad jabbed a shaking finger at me. "You have destroyed this family. Do you hear me? You have destroyed everything." I took a breath, slow, steady, weighted with years of swallowed pain. "No," I answered quietly. "This family destroyed me first. I'm just saving what Grandpa trusted me to protect." A few relatives sucked in sharp breaths. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another muttered, "She's right." But no one said it loudly enough to be brave. Dad shook his head violently. "You selfish girl. How dare you? How dare you undermine your brother like this after everything we've done for you?" I almost laughed. Everything they'd done for me? Every dismissal, every sneer, every slammed door? Was that the everything he meant? But instead of answering, I simply looked at him. Looked at all of them. Really looked. And for the first time, I didn't feel small beneath their gaze. I didn't shrink.
Didn't hesitate.
Didn't fold. Ethan lunged forward, snatching up the papers and flipping through them frantically. "Ava, please. Just tell me this is some kind of joke. You can't just take the company. You can't." I held his gaze. "Legally, I already have." He froze, breathing hard. His mouth opened, then closed again, like he couldn't form words. Finally, he whispered, Then give me something. A position. A role. Anything. I need this. You can't just leave me with nothing." The room watched him unravel. This grown man who had spent his entire life being praised for potential he never demonstrated. The man my father raised to believe the world would hand him whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it.
"A job?"
I repeated softly. He nodded desperately.
"Please. Just don't destroy me."
For the first time that night, real pity flickered in my chest. Not enough to erase the years of cruelty. Not enough to undo the damage he'd caused. But enough to recognize the pathetic truth. Ethan had no identity without the company he never worked for. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't savor the moment the way a villain might. Instead, I answered with a calm professionalism he'd never shown me. "I'll think about it," I said. "But not tonight." His face crumpled. Dad swore under his breath, pacing like a caged animal. "All these years," he hissed, "we tried to build something stable, something lasting, and you rewinded it out of spite." I straightened. "Out of spite? You gave Ethan everything. You told me I was nothing. You ignored every warning sign while he let the company fall apart. You refused to listen, not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't a son." The room was so quiet, you could hear the flames on the candles flickering. Dad opened his mouth to argue, but no words came, because deep down he knew I was right. He had known it for years. He simply refused to admit it. Mom wiped her tears with shaking hands. "Ava, honey, we didn't know how to include you." I swallowed hard. "You didn't want to include me." The truth hung there, heavy and irrevocable. As the shock spread through the relatives around us, their expressions shifted. Confusion first, then discomfort, then something else. A mixture of fear and respect, the kind reserved for someone who had just revealed the crown they forged in silence. Aunt Linda met my eyes from across the table. She was the only one who nodded, just once, a tiny gesture that said, "You did what needed to be done." But most of them looked away, too embarrassed, too complicit, too stunned to meet the gaze of the girl they had underestimated for 25 years. I picked up my wine glass, not to toast, not to celebrate, but simply because my hands needed something steady to anchor to. We can talk about the transition professionally, legally, transparently. Dad's face twisted. You can't just waltz in here and take control. I didn't waltz, I replied. I worked hard, quietly, for years, while you weren't paying attention. He flinched, actually flinched, because for the first time he saw the truth. His neglect wasn't just cruel. It was foolish. He chose the wrong child, the wrong heir, the wrong person to invest in. And now the consequences were here, unavoidable, undeniable, irreversible. I set my glass down gently. I'm not here to destroy the family, I added. But I am here to protect the company. Grandpa's company. The employees' livelihoods. The thing you forgot to take care of. No one argued. No one dared. This was the Fifth Valley, the moment everything they believed collapsed under the weight of reality. A family torn apart by their own choices. A dynasty shifted because they underestimated the quietest person at the table. And as I gathered my papers and turned toward the door, the entire room parted for me. Not out of politeness, but because they finally understood. I wasn't the forgotten daughter. I wasn't the outsider. I wasn't the afterthought. I was the one in control. Now, 1 year later, the world feels different. Not louder, not brighter, but clearer, as if someone had wiped a long fogged window I'd spent my entire life pressing my face against. I stand in the glass-walled conference room of Bennett Industrial Solutions, my company now, watching the winter light reflect off the polished floor. The logo Grandpa designed decades ago hangs behind me, restored to the original colors he'd chosen. I had spent the past 12 months rebuilding the business from its foundations, not transforming it completely. Grandpa had already built something solid, but redirecting it back to the principles he believed in: transparency, innovation, respect for workers, and sustainable growth. The things my father abandoned when he became too consumed with appearances. I wasn't the CEO. I didn't need the title. But I was the company's strategic director, the person every major decision passed through, the one the board trusted, the one employees came to for direction. And I did something my father never would have considered. I invited people who had built the company with Grandpa, his old colleagues, retired managers, former engineers, to return as advisors. The day they all walked into the boardroom, some using canes, some with silver hair, some with weathered hands and jackets that smelled faintly of machine oil, I felt like I had brought the past home. "You're Walt's girl," one of them said, clapping my shoulder. "No," another corrected with a grin. "She's Walt's legacy." They helped me modernize operations, renegotiate aging supplier contracts, update machinery, and implement employee-first policies Grandpa would have championed. And the numbers reflected it. Productivity rose, turnover dropped, partnerships blossomed, competitors took notice. The company, once flagged as a distressed asset, was now recognized as a rising example of ethical modernization. Not because of a miracle, not because of luck, but because the right person, someone who understood the engine, every part of it, was finally at the helm. As for Ethan, he didn't fall apart the way I once feared he would. Reality humbled him, and strangely, it also steadied him. After a long, tearful conversation 3 weeks after that Thanksgiving, he admitted he needed to figure out who he was without the company, without the entitlement, without the identity Dad had wrapped around him since childhood. He ended up finding an entry-level job at a small logistics firm. Nothing glamorous, nothing prestigious, but he stuck with it, showed up on time, learned how to be part of a team instead of the center of attention. We weren't close, but we weren't enemies anymore. He sent me a Christmas card that first year. Just my name, a short sentence, and his signature. But it meant something. Mom and Dad were harder. For months, they avoided me. Ashamed, angry, confused, and grieving the future they believed belonged to their son. They visited the factory less, called in frequently. But every time they saw the company thriving under the new leadership structure, something shifted. Respect, real, grudging respect, grew in the cracks where pride had once lived.
They still didn't know how to talk to me.
Not fully, not honestly, but they tried. Dad apologized once, in a stiff, halting way that didn't erase anything, but acknowledged everything. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic. But it was a beginning. I didn't forgive them instantly. Healing isn't a switch you flip. It's a thread you unspool slowly, carefully, patiently. And some threads don't tie back together. Some unravel and become something new. That year, for the first time in my life, I didn't spend Thanksgiving with my biological family. I didn't sit at the long, polished table under the judgmental chandelier. I didn't pretend to belong where I'd always been treated as an outsider. Instead, I hosted a dinner in my apartment, a warm, cluttered, laughter-filled space filled with the people who had shown up for me in ways my family never had. My best friend from college, 2 coworkers who had become sisters, my mentor from the firm, a neighbor who always watered my plants when I traveled, and even Aunt Linda, who arrived carrying pumpkin pie and a hug that felt like love and apology woven together. We sat on mismatched chairs. We ate on plates from different sets. We burned rolls.
We spilled wine.
We laughed until tears formed. And for the first time, Thanksgiving felt like something real. Something chosen.
Something that belonged to me.
A chosen family. A chosen home. A chosen life. When dessert came, someone raised a glass and said, "Ava, this year was yours." But I shook my head softly. "No," I whispered. "This year was Grandpa's." I stepped out onto the balcony later that night, looking out at the shimmering city, the cold wind brushing my face gently, almost like a hand. I closed my eyes and whispered the words I'd carried for 20 years. "Grandpa, you believed in me. I just needed time to prove you right." A long silence settled around me, peaceful, full, warm despite the cold. Then I turned back inside, where my chosen family waited, laughing, calling my name, where I was loved, not for my power or my inheritance, but for the person I had fought tooth and nail to become. And before I closed the balcony door, I whispered one last message for anyone listening, anyone hurting, anyone who had ever been the overlooked one at a table full of people who should have loved them. Your worth isn't defined by who fails to see it. Build your life anyway. And when you're ready, choose the people who choose you. That was the real legacy. Not the company, not the shares, not the power, but the courage to write my own story and choose my own family. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt that gut-wrenching choice between loyalty and your own integrity, then you know this feeling. You're not alone. I want to hear your story too. Share it in the comments below, or just let me know what part hit you the hardest. If you believe in standing up for what's right, even when it's terrifying, please give this video a big thumbs up. Subscribe to join this community where we talk about finding our strength, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's next. Your support helps amplify these vital conversations. Thank you for listening.